children arriving in court for day one of their father's sex trafficking trial in New York. Hands gripped.
Do you believe your father's innocent? Do you still convinced your father's innocent?
Your daddy got 4 years! Your daddy got 4 years!
Everyone thinks they already understand this story. They think it starts with Diddy and ends with Diddy. But the moment this trailer dropped, that version of the story stopped working.
Abusing women! That's wrong! We should get more!
Fight this to the end.
Not because of what was said, but because of what wasn't. This trailer doesn't feel like a defense. It doesn't feel like damage control. It feels like an interruption. And interruptions are dangerous. Because for months, this story moved in one direction only. One voice stayed in front. One perspective shaped the conversation. One version repeated itself until it felt permanent. That's how narratives harden. Not through evidence, through exposure. Repeat the same framing long enough, attach it to authority, package it as truth. And people stop asking who decided that framing in the first place. Here's the shift most people missed. When Diddy's sons released this trailer, they didn't challenge anyone directly. They didn't defend. They didn't accuse. They stepped out of the noise. And that silence wasn't weakness. It was disruption. Because silence breaks rhythm, and rhythm is how stories stay in control. This trailer doesn't try to win the argument. It forces the audience to pause. And pausing is dangerous, because pausing gives people time to think. Here's where the story starts to tilt. Every major downfall creates space, and in hip-hop, space never stays empty. When one figure is pushed to the center of blame, someone else is always standing just outside the frame, ready to explain, ready to interpret, ready to benefit. So before this goes any deeper, pause for a second. Ask yourself this, honestly. Who spoke the loudest while Diddy became the villain? Who positioned himself not just as a critic, but as the authority on what this story meant? Because documentaries don't just show stories. They assign meaning to them. They decide what matters. They decide what's replayed, and they decide what disappears. Before we go further, make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon. Because once you see how this narrative was shaped, you'll want every update that comes next. Now watch what this trailer does differently. Diddy doesn't speak at all. No statement, no explanation, no attempt to control the narrative. Instead, you see fragments, headlines, phone calls, moments that feel unfinished. And that's intentional, because when someone removes their voice, they force you to question the voices that replaced it. This isn't about proving innocence. This is about exposing how a story was constructed and who was allowed to construct it. And once you notice that, the story doesn't feel settled anymore. It feels open. And open stories are the hardest ones to control. The story didn't move on its own. It was guided. And this is where 50 Cent enters the frame. Not as a bystander, but as a narrator. Because 50 Cent didn't just react to what was happening. He explained it, he packaged it, he framed it for the world. That distinction matters. In moments like this, the person who speaks first doesn't just share an opinion. They define how everyone else is allowed to think. And 50 Cent understood that better than almost anyone. He didn't wait for clarity. He didn't wait for balance. He moved early, when attention was raw, when outrage was easy, when nuance was inconvenient. That's how authority is built. Not by proving every claim, but by becoming the loudest interpreter of events before anyone else has time to slow down. Once that happens, something subtle shifts. Your voice stops sounding like commentary and starts sounding like conclusion. Your perspective becomes the lens. Your judgment becomes the reference point. And anyone who disagrees doesn't look informed. They look defensive. That's power. Because when a story is told with confidence and repetition, people stop checking where it came from. They assume the storyteller has nothing to gain. But here's the part that can't be ignored. Every time Diddy's name was pushed deeper into controversy, another image quietly rose in contrast. Disciplined, clear, untouched by the chaos. That contrast didn't happen by accident. It was built. Through interviews that reinforced one direction, through projects that locked in a single interpretation, through repetition that turned perspective into perceived truth. And once that framing settled, it didn't matter what came next. The audience had already been taught how to see the story. This is where things get uncomfortable, because you don't get to tell a story this decisively without benefiting from where it lands. Relevance returned. Authority solidified. A moral high ground was claimed without ever being questioned. And while the spotlight stayed fixed on one man, no one asked why the narrator's past connections were never part of the conversation. Not because they didn't exist, but because they complicated the message. Complication weakens control. Simplicity strengthens it. That's why the story stayed clean. One villain, one voice of truth. Until now. Because the sons don't enter as commentators. They enter as witnesses. And witnesses don't need to dominate the room. They only need to exist. That's what disrupts authority. Because authority relies on being uncontested. And the moment another perspective appears, calm, restrained, personal, the original narrator loses something crucial. Not relevance, control. And once control slips, the audience starts noticing things they were never meant to notice. About timing, about benefit, about why one voice was allowed to speak uninterrupted for so long. That's the shift happening here. Quiet, precise, and impossible to reverse. Timing is never neutral. It's a weapon when you know how to use it. And this is where the story stops being emotional and starts being strategic. Because this narrative didn't explode at a random moment. It didn't surface when facts were still forming. It didn't wait for clarity. It arrived when outrage was most profitable, when social media rewarded certainty over questions, when platforms pushed anger faster than nuance, when picking a side mattered more than understanding the whole picture. That timing wasn't luck, it was leverage. When a story drops at the peak of emotional readiness, it doesn't need depth. It just needs direction, and that direction was clear. Repeat the same framing, recycle the same clips, drive the same conclusion, not slowly, not carefully, all at once. That's how momentum is manufactured. Because once momentum builds, it does the work for you. It silences hesitation, it punishes doubt, it turns disagreement into isolation. People don't want to be on the wrong side of outrage, so they stop asking uncomfortable questions. That's the environment this story was released into. And in that environment, whoever controls the first version controls every version that follows. Here's what most people didn't notice. While the spotlight stayed fixed on Diddy, the rest of the industry stayed unusually quiet. No competing narratives, no real pushback, no alternative framing given room to breathe. That silence wasn't agreement, it was alignment. Because challenging a dominant narrative at its peak comes with a cost, and not everyone is willing to pay it. So the story moved forward untouched, unchallenged, presented as settled, until the moment it wasn't. Because timing cuts both ways, and the same patience that builds influence can be used to dismantle it. The sons didn't respond immediately, they didn't rush to catch the wave. They waited until the outrage cooled, until certainty felt safe, until the audience stopped expecting resistance. That's when intervention works best. Not when emotions are high, but when complacency sets in. Because complacency creates blind spots. And blind spots are where control breaks down. That's what this trailer represents. Not a reaction to accusations, but a challenge to timing itself. It arrives late on purpose, calm on purpose, restrained on purpose, and that restraint forces a comparison between urgency and patience, between performance and presence, between a story designed to move fast and a perspective that refuses to rush. Once viewers sense that contrast, they start reevaluating everything that came before it. Not emotionally, strategically. And that's dangerous for anyone who relied on momentum, because momentum disappears the moment people slow down. And right now, this story is slowing everyone down. Every narrative has a payoff, and this is the part people avoid talking about, because when one name absorbs all the damage, someone else always walks away lighter. That's not opinion. That's how attention economies work. While Diddy became the symbol of everything wrong, the conversation narrowed. It simplified. It became easier to digest. And simplification has value, because when the story is small enough, it stops threatening the people standing nearby. Here's the uncomfortable math. As the outrage intensified, authority consolidated. Certain voices gained reach. Certain platforms gained relevance. Certain reputations stayed clean, not because they were untouched, but because they were positioned at a safe distance. Distance protects. It lets someone comment without being questioned, criticize without being implicated, explain the chaos without ever standing inside it. That's the advantage of framing. You don't have to erase your history if the story never turns the camera in your direction. And that's what made this phase feel lopsided. One man carried the entire weight of collapse. The industry nodded. The audience followed. Not because they examined everything, but because the structure encouraged them not to. Clean stories move faster. Messy ones slow people down. And slowing down is dangerous when momentum is doing the work for you. So the narrative stayed clean. Clear villain, clear authority, clear moral outcome, until the benefit became impossible to ignore. Because whenever a story only asks who failed and never asks who gained, it's incomplete. And incompleteness is where power hides. That's why the Suns don't attack the accusations directly. They don't need to. They change the angle. They remind the audience that collapses don't happen in isolation. That power doesn't vanish, it redistributes. And that silence, when chosen, can be more revealing than defense. Once that realization lands, the story stops being about wrongdoing alone. It becomes about leverage, about who got louder, who got cleaner, who gained authority while the spotlight burned someone else. And when viewers start asking those questions, the narrative loses its balance. Because now the audience isn't just reacting to what happened. They're evaluating who benefited from how it was told. That's when certainty fades. And when certainty fades, control follows right behind. What makes this moment different isn't volume, it's proximity. Because the Suns don't enter this story as commentators. They enter it as people who lived inside it. Not through headlines, not through edits, but through absence. Missed calls, interrupted routines, rooms that changed when the cameras left. That kind of experience doesn't translate into sound bites. It doesn't perform well on panels. And it doesn't fit neatly into a pre-built narrative, which is exactly why it matters. The trailer doesn't rush to explain anything. It doesn't try to correct the record point by point. It does something far more unsettling. It slows everything down. It replaces conclusions with moments, reactions with distance, noise with restraint. And restraint is uncomfortable for an audience trained to consume certainty. Because certainty tells you what to think. Restraint asks you to notice. Notice how little space was ever given to people closest to the fallout. Notice how easily their silence was interpreted for them. Notice how quickly personal cost was flattened into public spectacle. That's the shift the Suns introduce. They don't argue facts. They challenge framing. They remind the audience that stories told from a distance often miss what matters most up close. That behind every viral moment is a private consequence that never trends. And once you register that contrast, the tone of the entire story changes. It stops feeling like an expose. It starts feeling like a construction, something assembled, curated, protected by momentum. That's why this intervention lands now. Not earlier, when emotions were raw and reactions predictable, but later, when certainty settled in and questions stopped coming. Because that's when perspective does the most damage. When it doesn't shout over the narrative, but stands quietly beside it. And in that quiet, something becomes obvious. The people who controlled the story spoke endlessly about accountability. The people who lived the consequences barely spoke at all. That imbalance isn't accidental, it's structural. And the moment it's exposed, the audience can't return to the story the same way. Because now every claim carries a shadow. Every conclusion feels provisional. Every authority feels conditional. Not because the Suns demanded it, but because their presence made absence impossible to ignore. That's the real disruption here, not a counterattack, a recalibration. A reminder that no matter how polished a narrative becomes, it can't fully contain the people who are actually there. And once those people step into view, even quietly, the story has to change. Once the audience starts noticing structure, they stop reacting to content and start reading intention. That's the turning pressure in this phase, because now viewers aren't asking whether a claim sounds convincing. They're asking why it was framed that way in the first place. why certain clips were looped, why specific timelines were emphasized, why alternative perspectives never gained traction. Those questions don't explode on impact. They spread, quietly, persistently. They move backward through the story, reframing moments that once felt definitive into moments that feel selective, and selection changes meaning. A statement that once sounded authoritative now sounds rehearsed. A reaction that once felt spontaneous now feels positioned. This is where influence begins to lose its edge. Because influence depends on trust, and trust depends on the belief that nothing important was left out. Once that belief cracks, the audience doesn't need new information. They need context. And context is the one thing momentum can't outrun. That's why the conversation feels heavier now. Not louder, more deliberate. People are replaying what they already saw, but with different questions in mind. Who decided this was the moment? Who benefited from speed? Who needed certainty before doubt could form? Those questions don't accuse. They destabilize. They turn confidence into vulnerability. They turn authority into exposure. Because now, every storyteller is being evaluated not by how loudly they spoke, but by how much they controlled. And control is visible once you know what to look for. You see it in what wasn't challenged, in who wasn't asked to explain themselves, in how quickly complexity was dismissed as distraction. That's when the audience's role changes. They stop being consumers. They become analysts. They don't wait for conclusions. They test them. And once that happens, the narrative can't move forward untouched. It has to justify itself. That's the pressure building here. Not outrage. Scrutiny. The kind that doesn't trend fast but lasts longer than any headline. Because people don't forget the moment they realize they were guided instead of informed. And from that point on, every new claim enters a different environment. One where certainty has to earn its place, where authority is provisional, where silence and speed are no longer neutral. That's why this phase matters. Not because it introduces new accusations, but because it changes how accusations are received. Once that shift happens, control doesn't disappear, but it stops being automatic. And automatic control is the only kind that ever really worked. There's a moment when every carefully managed story reaches a point it can't recover from. Not because it's proven wrong, but because it's no longer trusted. That moment doesn't arrive with chaos, it arrives with awareness. Because once people recognize design, they stop mistaking it for truth. And that's where this ends differently than anyone expected. This was never just about Diddy, and it was never just about allegations, documentaries, or headlines. It was about control, about who got to speak first, who got to frame the meaning, who benefited while the spotlight stayed fixed in one direction. For a long time, that control held. The story moved fast. Outrage did the heavy lifting. Certainty felt comfortable. But certainty is fragile. All it takes is one interruption, one perspective that refuses to perform, to expose how tightly everything was arranged. That's what this trailer represents. Not a defense, not a rebuttal, a fracture. A moment where the audience stops asking what to believe and starts asking why they believed it so easily. And once that question exists, no narrative stays intact. Because now every move is watched, every response is measured, every silence is interpreted. The storyteller becomes the story. That's the shift no one can undo. From this point forward, nothing lands the same way. Every explanation feels strategic. Every claim feels provisional. Every authority feels conditional. Not because someone shouted louder, but because someone chose not to. And in that restraint, the most dangerous thing happened. People started thinking for themselves. That's why this doesn't end here. And that's why it won't go back to how it was. Because once control is noticed, it can't hide again. The story didn't collapse, it lost its grip. And in the end, that's the one thing power never survives.